Okay, well, all right, so typography. Why typography? I started, I just want to learn anything I can do to improve my typography. Yes, well, we're definitely going to do that. So the reason I put this talk together is because when I first started in the web, previously, before doing that, I was doing a lot of digital stuff and a lot of paper stuff before the digital. So a lot of the traditional media, so your acrylics, your oils, and a lot of typography stuff. And so having gorgeous handwriting was a huge skill, and a skill I was often praised for. Then I got into the digital world, and that skill became absolutely obsolete. And I was like, well, typography is fun and beautiful. How can I translate this into the digital world? And so I started looking at ways in which in CSS, I could do some of the things I was doing on paper. So that's how and so the list of all of these things that we're going to go over today is kind of how I came up with this. It's all of the things that I was doing on paper and I was doing with inks and that I was trying to do on the web. My name is Martine Dowden. I currently work for Andromeda Galactic Solutions, and where I do UX and UI work for the most part, and some JavaScript and some Angular, and all those fun things as well. So let's take a look. First, we're going to take a look back into history a little bit, because in typography, you can't really look at typography without understanding how that world came along, right? With typography comes the ability you want to communicate. The whole point of it is to communicate something and to write, which is something that we've been doing since the dawn of civilization. Anywhere from, if we look back to Lascaux and the Paleolithic paintings in southern France, that's the one all the way on the bottom left with the little horse-looking thing. They didn't have quite letters yet, but they were already trying to communicate something. Fast forward sometimes into the cuneiform era. The cuneiforms were usually done by the Sumerians. We're starting to look something that looks more writing-like, right? Now, in this little very, very fast-forwarded version of history, I'm skipping entire swashes of cultures and of major handwritings for the sake of time, because you guys want to get to the CSS and to the actual implementation. This isn't just a history lesson, so that's why we're doing that. So be aware that there's a slew of other handwritings and other cultures that we're just completely omitting at this particular point in time. Fast forward to the interesting part about the early Greek and the Phoenicians is then we start really seeing some efficiency being built into the handwriting. The hieroglyphics for the Egyptians were something that didn't need to have quite the succinctness because it was made mostly for religious purposes originally. Once we get to the Phoenicians, the whole point was business. We needed to be able to do business transactions, logs of who owes how much money, etc. So we wanted that really quick ability to do it fast and to do it efficiently. As we fast forward, we then see the manuscripts, which are a huge base for some of the typography in terms of what we think of a lot of times when we think of beautiful handwriting. We think of manuscripts, right? The Book of Kells, for example, is a gorgeous example. The typography in the world of it really took a turn when it came along the printing press. Because what the printing press did is it allowed us to standardize and it allowed us to produce very, very quickly. But with the printing press came limitations, right? Because now, if you're thinking of somebody, whether they're chiseling it into stone or whether they're writing it on paper, you have something that is very, very non-constraining. It all has to do with the skill of the person doing it. They can write anywhere on the page. They can draw anything that they want. With the printing press, now we are constrained to what does our type look like? What are those pieces of metal that we're putting into the press? We're limited to what those are capable of doing. With the steam press was another huge step forward because it increased production and the ability to produce at a very vast scale. And then along came the web. And the web changed things again because now we had to rebuild all of those skills that we had for the print, that we had built up for this printing press, being able to kern letters, being able to add spacing between our lines, being able to, excuse me, to do indents. All of those things, now we have to relearn how to do. And to do those things, we have CSS. The other thing that changed is no longer are our typefaces, so our fonts, pieces of metal or wood, depending on the era and the press, that we are putting into a machine with something that is digital. And so we see a change in our fonts as well. So all of those things kind of work together into forming what we have today, which is still forever evolving. I was just on a tweet today, we're talking about what would we like to see as advancements in typography for CSS. So it's still very much evolving today. So typography, what does that word actually mean? It comes from the Greek typos, meaning impression, and from the Latin graphia, which means to write. So we've mixed Latin and Greek together, shoved it together, made a word. And so it basically just means the art of designing with type, right? So how do we do that on the web? Well, the first thing we have to think of is our specific typefaces. Now, you've heard me use that word a couple times, and so I will give you the kind of quick and dirty definition. If you use font, it totally works, although a typeface is the actual alphabet that you're using. So in terms of the physical world, think the box of type that you're going to use in terms of the style. So it's the name, right? And then font means that you've added a size and a weight. So the typeface would be Helvetica, and the font would be Helvetica Bold 12 point, right? Generally speaking, unless you're dealing with a hoity-toity designer, everybody understands what you're saying. The typefaces are going to be the start of what you're doing with your type. So like in this particular slide, we have Montserrat for the header, and we have Railway for the text. And so those are some definite things that you're going to need to choose from the very, very beginning as you're designing your application. Generally speaking, the CSS for that, we can set it as by just with the property font family. And so what we're going to do there is simply assign whatever font family we want, and then we're going to do fallbacks. And the reason we're going to do fallbacks is because if those fonts don't load, or if the person that is viewing your application does not have those fonts on their machine, they're going to need to default to something. So that's why we put defaults down the line. Feel free to ask questions as I'm talking about it. I am monitoring the chat as I am speaking. Some of the vocabulary that we see around typefaces, some of it translates into what we do on the web, some of it does not, but a lot of it is based on those metal types and those metal prints from the printing press. So we see the big ones that we're going to want to keep in mind are going to be serif and sans serif. So serifs are those little things. If you look at the letter H on the slide, the little accents at the end of it, or at the bottom of the letter P, you'll see a little dash at the bottom. Those are your serifs. The bet part of alphabet does not have any serifs. That's an important distinction. The rest of it has to do are important when we consider how we're going to align our text and how we're going to scale and increase or decrease the size of our text. So these are two examples. The one on the left is sans serif, the one on the right is serif. The reason I keep on harping on serif and sans serif is because they've done studies. I believe it was the University of Leipzig, but don't quote me on that. But they looked at how readable text is on a screen versus text is on paper, and what makes for a font being more readable versus not. And they found that on paper, people found serif text a lot more readable versus on screen sans serif text to be more readable. And the reason that they think that is because they looked at several different typefaces, and they found that the construction of the typeface had very little to do with how readable it was going to be. What they found is that what people were used to seeing was what they were most comfortable with. And so with the web came a lot of new fonts. A lot of the serif fonts historically were the ones you would see from the printing presses. And those are ones that you would see a lot on paper. If you think Times New Roman, for example, very common everywhere in print because it's incredibly legible. It was made for the New York Times specifically because of its legibility. And so that's what we're used to seeing on paper. The web, because of Web 2.0 and that whole stylistic movement, we saw a lot of sans serif come along. And so we're used to seeing sans serif on the web. So in terms of your legibility for large bodies of text, pick a sans serif font. For your titles, you can do, you have a lot more leeway in terms of an artistic license in terms of what you pick. But for your large bodies of text, for the meat of your content, make sure you're using a sans serif. So we have sans serif and sans serif. Right? The other options are that you're going to see are display fonts. Those are your fun ones. Those are the ones that have a lot of stuff going on. This is monotone, for example. Those are really cool for titles and stuff, but they're not very, very good for large content because they're going to be very difficult to read. They're beautiful, and do use them for your titles, for inside of your logos, for those sorts of things, but you're not going to be able to do large quantities of content with those. The other option is monospace. As developers, we're very, very familiar with those. Those are the ones we use in our IDE. So if you're doing code, for example, or displaying code, those are always a good option. In terms of the web, basically there's only a handful of fonts that most people are going to have on their machines consistently. And those are Georgia, Times New Roman, Arial, Trebuchet, Verdana, and Courier. Anything other than that, pretty much it's anybody's guess if the person is going to be able to read it on their machine. And so at that point, we start needing to be able to either do fallbacks on one of those that is actually going to more than likely be on their machine. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I've mentioned. Or we're going to have to load those fonts specifically to make sure our users have them. Generally speaking, when you're looking at fonts and when you're looking at picking fonts, what we're going to want to do is find a font that has a lot of options. Some fonts will only have 1 or 2. Some will have, just as this example for, it's in Railway, has a lot of options in terms of bolds and italics. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to be able to bold a letter in our text or italicize a letter in our text. And if those fonts don't exist, you're not going to be able to do that. And so keeping in mind that the way a font works is that it's not just magically, although so there is some new technology out there for some fonts that can now do that. But for the most part, the vast majority of the fonts today, when you're doing bold, when you're doing italics, it's not some algorithms that's just increasing or decreasing the size or slanting or unslanting the text. It's literally a different set of letters that is being loaded instead. Okay, so we need to make sure that when we're importing our fonts, we have some options if we want to be able to do those things. The place I generally go for my fonts is Google Fonts for several reasons. One, they're open source, and I don't have to worry about licensing, and I don't have to worry about the cost, because just like pictures, just like videos, just like music, fonts do have copyright. The other reason is it's a known source. It's a safe source. I know I'm not going to be downloading some kind of virus or some kind of malware into my system, or injecting malware into my website. So I generally go there. The other thing I really like about them is you remember how we were just talking about the number of styles available? I can filter what's available based on the number of styles that there is. So generally speaking, what I'll do is I'll select the font that I want to do. Then you can go into the review and it'll give you basically the import URL to be able to just import it into your site. The other thing, you can also go ahead and download them in order to install them on your machine if you like. But for the web, instead of loading them locally onto my system, I generally just do the URL, because the likelihood of somebody already having that cached is actually pretty high, because a lot of people do use Google Fonts, and so I'm banking on them already having that cached for improvement on my on the speed on my site. So that's what we're going to do. So once we have our font loaded, we can start doing things looking at bold value. For bold, you can either do a number. The numbers are 1 through 900, or you can use words. So you've got normal, bold, lighter, and bolder. Those all revolve around those numbers, though, right? Remember when I had the full list of all of the fonts? If you don't have an equivalent of 200, it's going to try to find the closest thing on the list that it can get to, right? So if you only have the one font and it doesn't have any bold or doesn't have any or any lighter fonts, then it's just going to stick to what it was originally. So the web does try to compensate in case you flub it, but it's only so much you can't do. It can't indent something that's not there. Oh yeah, 400 is generally considered normal. 700 is bold. So if you're dealing with numbers instead of the words, those are the equivalences. I need to bring up italic and oblique because those are actually two very different things. And they're actually quite annoying and complicated. Because what happens is italics is a brand new set, it's a brand new font, right? It's something you have to load. Oblique, on the other hand, remember I said how for some things there was an algorithm that kind of changed the letters. That's what oblique does. It literally takes the current set of letters and skews it to the right. So the thing is, though, if you have an italic option loaded on your computer and you do an oblique, the computer will still use the italic version. If you so that's where italic and oblique get really obnoxious. But as you can see from the of in my sentence, the letters are very different for italic and oblique because it's not using the same set of letters. The advantage of oblique, however, is that you can actually choose how far that slant is going to be. Italic, you can't do that because it's just a font you're loading. Does that make sense? So those are the differences between the two. One of the other things you can do is do a text shadow. Those are really obnoxious. I don't really care for them, generally speaking, but they exist, so I figured I'd show it off. The problem with text shadows is they make the font difficult to read. So it's something that you can potentially play with on like a title or something, or because you're wanting to really emphasize something specific, but please don't put that on your general bodies of text. It'll make it completely unreadable. So we have our text. We've chosen a font. That's great. But let's look at our line spacing. We can actually adjust that. This particular view is very, very condensed. So let's see what we can do to adjust that a little bit. What we can do is using line height, which is essentially the space between each of the lines in our text, we can actually adjust what that space is going to look like. Generally speaking, in typography, we call that leading, because literally in the printing press days, they would take pieces of lead, and that's in order to add space between the lines. Now we just call it line height, and we generally don't use lead for obvious reasons. The thing with when you're adjusting line height is you actually don't want to give it a unit. Because if you give it a unit, if I say a line height of 1.75 rem, the problem, and I then increase my font, the problem is that stays put. It doesn't increase with the size of the font. So we get overlapping stuff, which can do some really cool visual effects if that's what you're going for, but for readability, not so great. If we don't put a unit at all, now it's going to automatically scale to whatever your font size is and appropriately increase and decrease the size between your lines based on your font size. So as a general rule, unless you're going for a specific visual effect, you don't want to put a unit on your line height. Drop caps. Drop caps are super pretty and super cool, and those are actually possible as well. Those are things you see a lot in manuscripts. They're that letter at the very beginning, at the very top. It's usually quite ornate, and it's usually significantly bigger. And we can use that using the first letter selector. So at any point on a paragraph, on a div, on a whatever, you can actually use the first letter selector to get to that first letter and do stuff with it. Generally speaking, though, because it's going to want to align itself to the baseline is like if you were to draw a line immediately at the top of the small letters, that's going to be your baseline. Now at the bottom of your small letters, it's going to be your baseline. So what's going to happen is, in order to get it to drop, we're going to have to do some a float, or we're going to have to do some layout finagling in order for it to drop. So what I've done here is I've selected the first letter in the paragraph, given it a color, and then gone ahead and assigned it its size, et cetera, and changed its look and changed its feel in order to give it a drop cap. But you'll have to play around with your margins and with your in order to get it situated just right. That's also the reason that it has a display block, in order for it to be able to get floated and for it to be able to get in order to be able to add margins to it. The same way we can select the first letter, we can select the first line. That allows us to do all of the fun things we want. In this case, I changed the color. The thing is, unfortunately, you know how for divs and for other selectors, we can do nth of type, or we can do nth of something. In terms of letters and line, we are currently limited to first line and first letter. There's no nth of line or nth of letter. It'd be super cool if there was, but there isn't. And there is also, as far as I know, no way to select an actual, just a word. So you're stuck with first line and first letter. But you do not need to put spans in there. You do not need to put divs in there. That will just automatically. So let's take a closer look at our links. So now we have our drop cap. We have our first line pretty. Let's take and we have some more spacing between our text. So it's a little bit airy. It's a little bit easier to read. Let's take a look at our links and go ahead and do some adjustments on our links. The thing about our links is that we can go ahead and do a slew of text decorations with them. That's where the underline comes from. And so with that, we can adjust what the underline is. We can adjust its color. We can adjust how it looks, and we can also sort of, and I say sort of, and I'll explain a little bit more why, the position of the underline. So with the underline, what we have is we can actually choose, we can choose to remove it entirely. We can use to put it on top with overline. We can decide to do a strike through with line through, or we can do underline, which is your kind of default. We can also do, I don't know why you would want to do that, but you can. You can also do all of it all together. So you can totally do overline, underline, and line through if you're specifically using the text decoration line property. So that's pretty cool. The other thing you can do is change the type of line. So you can do your solid, double, dotted, dashed, or wavy. I personally find wavy to be super cute. Unfortunately, it's often associated with spell check. So watch that a little bit. But I like the wavies. I think they're cute. You can also determine the position of the underline. So you can actually say a position under versus auto. So the first one, the SID has a position under, this position auto. In the daemon, I put the position under. The problem with that is, as you can see from the Can I Use print off or screenshot, it's not very well supported at this time. It's just not. So you can use it, and if it doesn't exist for that particular browser, it'll just do an auto and be done. It's not gonna like massively crash on you or anything like that. It's not catastrophic. But know that yeah, your mileage may vary. So now that we have some stuff a little bit prettied up, let's look at our line length. Because if I extend my window really large, that's not ideal to read either. Because I don't know if you guys have ever tried to read like really long lines. You kind of lose where you're at some point. So in order to kind of look at, there's a kind of a general rule on how to figure out your line length. And that is, you're going to take whatever font you're using, and you're going to write out an alphabet and a half and 2 alphabets back to back. And those are going to give you, so that gives you about 39 and 54 characters. That is about roughly the line length that is ideal for reading. That is like the perfect line length, if you will, somewhere in between those 39 and 54 letters. So on the web, that's a little bit difficult to do. However, what we have is just the same way you can do pixels and rems to determine your font size, you can actually use CH. And what CH does is it looks at the width of the number 0 for that alphabet, and that's what it bases as a unit. So it's a relative unit to the current font size, right? So, and what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and set your length to basically do. So in the example below, I have P max width 54ch. It's the length is going to be the equivalent of 54 zeros at whatever font size I have set. If that makes sense. So that's a really nice way to be able to determine, and you can use that on padding, you can use that on margin, you can use that on a slew of other things. You can use that on border, like CH works on all the other properties where you can use a unit value. But for specifically determining line length, it's very convenient. So what we can do is go ahead and use that to max width our line length, give us we can do our margins, whatever. That works out pretty well. So these are all of the units you have available to you in CSS. Obviously, in this case, we're going to focus a little bit on CH. I'm also going to mention EX. EX is based on the X height of the font. That's basically if you take a lowercase letter, it's the height of the lowercase letter is the X height. And so that can be interesting for doing spacing in terms of your line height, or in terms of, I use it oftentimes for vertical padding. I found that it's convenient for that. So if we go ahead and, so these two examples show, if I go for the low range, 39 letters versus the 54 letters, kind of what that looks like in terms of a UI, in terms of a piece of text, right? That's what that would pan out to be in terms of like ideal length for line length. We can also do columns to help us. The really cool things about columns, and no, this is not grid. This is simply saying that I want a certain number of columns, and I'm going to tell it what column widths and what kind of gap it's going to have. The downside to just doing columns is that so all I have to do is set a column width, and it'll automatically put my text in based on, and the width of the window or the width of the viewport will determine how many times it can put a column of 39 CH, and so that's how many columns I'm going to land with. It's great. However, what it does is it takes the entire body of text and it basically splits it up 1, 2, and 3. So you end up with vertical scroll in order to get to the bottom of that column. As you can see from the text here, it's cut off the last line of the first column. It makes no sense with the first line of the next column because you need to scroll down and then scroll all the way back up in order to get to the next column. So not ideal for on the web. What it is really good for though, before I get to that. So if you cap the height, then you get sideways scroll, which is not ideal either. However, what it is very, very good for is print. Because print, you have a definite sheet of paper, right? It's a very limited space. And the CSS is actually intelligent enough to know to go back to the top on the same sheet of paper. So like in this case, if there was, for like the second page, the flow is correct. So it's going to go all the way down first column, all the way down second column, go to the next page, all the way down first column, all the way down second column. So when you're doing a print layout, the column option is very, very convenient and works quite well. And the way you do that is just through the media query at print. So at media print, and that will do a layout specifically for being able to print. So I've used that several times to make some nice ability to print something out nicely in terms of because the print view versus the web views are going to be a little different usually. Text indent. I don't know if you guys remember being in school and having to indent the first paragraph. We can do that in CSS. It's literally just text indent, and then you can give it any kind of value. Be aware though that it is each line versus hanging. You can do that with, but those are experimental. So you can go ahead and play with that, but those are still not only experimental in terms of the spec may still change, but also the mileage may vary depending on which browser you're on. What we can also do with our text is determine, okay, we have our pretty drop cap, we have our pretty links, we have decided what our line length is going to be. How do we want to make the paragraph visually look on its edges? So we have a couple options here. We can do center, we can do left, justify, and right. The thing is, the easiest to read is always going to be left so text align left. And the reason for that is when you're looking at center or right, you don't know where to come back to when you're going to the next line. So visually, you have to hunt for where the line begins. If your lines on the left are all justifies and neatly aligned, you don't have to do that hunting. So it's a lot less tiring and a lot easier to follow. Obviously, this is for left to right handwriting. If you've got handwriting that's going from top to bottom or right to left or bottom up, you're going to have to adjust that right. Wherever you start reading from is where you want to be justified in the same way. A lot of what I'm talking about today is very, very geared towards Latin handwriting. So be aware of that if you're dealing with a different alphabet that does not use Latin letters or that is written in a different direction, Hebrew, for example, some of this won't apply just because we're dealing with a different perspective, different point of view, and a completely different direction in terms of reading. So justify, you would think, because it does definitely follow that rule with everybody being aligned to the left and continuing. The problem with justify is that it changes the natural spacing between letters and between words, I mean. So what happens is if that spacing ends up being too wide or too narrow or awkward, you end up with what's called a river, which means that you end up with a lot of white space coming down between your letters, and it almost creates these weird white columns on your page. So you want to be careful of those because it does make it a little bit harder to read, which is why your standard default left justify is still going to be your best bet. As much as justified is still the prettiest, at least in my opinion. The left justify is going to be, or the text align left is still going to be your better bet. The other thing we can do is kerning, which is letter spacing. Generally speaking, in kerning, when we're dealing with typography, so the actual metal physical piece, we can adjust one letter at a time. When we're dealing with paper and print, we can adjust, again, one letter at a time. However, when we're dealing with the web, we don't have that option yet. We can only say, I'm going to go ahead and group all of them and change the width for the kerning for all of them. So I'm going to scrunch it or I'm going to space it out, however the case might be. So the name for that is kerning. However, the CSS property we use is letter spacing. And so we can go ahead and say, I'm going to make it much more wide or much more narrow. That's up to you. But again, note, because we're messing with the natural way the letters lie, we're going to make it more difficult to read. So if it's something you want to put emphasis on, you want people to slow down and notice, it's a great thing. But if it's, again, large bodies of text, you don't want to do that with. There's a couple font variants that you can also use, and there's a lot of them, and it's quite complex. I'm going to focus on ligatures and numbers because those are things that we're going to see often and that are going to be stuff that you're going to use probably on a regular basis. Ligatures, what those are this is Railway. Railway has a number of them. I believe Lato also has some if you want to find alphabets that do. But between certain letters, they've got special characters that have been created in order to merge those two letters into one glyph. And so the most common places you're going to find ligatures are between FI, FL, FF, and so FFI and FFL. Those are the most often places, but it's basically where there's been created an extra character in order to make the combination of two letters pretty. The other thing I'm going to mention are numbers. So you can adjust whether or not you want the font to have ligatures. The other piece is numbers. Railway, for example, has what's called old-time figures, which means that they are not aligned based on your baseline. They'll kind of hop up and hop down. And so if you're doing something, if you're just putting a number in the middle of text, it doesn't matter as much. If you're using a font like Lato in your application, and suddenly you have a column to show KPIs or numbers or prices or whatever, having those fonts not aligned correctly can be a little odd. And so what you can do is you can go ahead and force them to act like a modern figure. A modern figure, all of the numbers are the same height and are all aligned on the baseline. And so how we do that is we can go ahead and say font variant lighting numbers, and that will allow the numbers to go ahead and, by saying lining numbers as a property, go ahead and make them act like modern style instead of the old style. Other things you can do with font variants, which is super fun, is small caps, which basically makes it look all capital, except you actually have capital letters. So that's a fun one to use as well. Text transform is a fun property, and it will allow us to do some things that we often kind of think of doing with JavaScript, but really don't have to. If we want to set something to all uppercase, all lowercase, or capitalize it, we can actually just use text transform. The thing is, though, and you'll run into the, if you're trying to normalize your text, and you have something where you don't know if it's going to come in all uppercase or all whatever, and you're wanting to have something where you've got just the first letter capitalized, but you're wanting to make sure it's not going to show up in all uppercase because you've got the two back to back, those are going to override each other. And so you can't just say, here, I want lowercase, and then I'm going to add a capitalize, and it'll be lowercase and then capitalize. The capitalized will override the lowercase. So in those cases, you are going to have to revert to JavaScript in order to normalize at least part of it. So worth knowing that just putting them back to back, they won't stack, they will overwrite each other. Images are super fun and super cool, and that is something we can use in our text. Float, I know float has gotten a bad rap over the years because float is actually quite difficult to handle correctly. And so we've kind of moved away from float, but float had a very, very good reason for existence, and still do, is that it literally allows your text to wrap around your image. The really cool thing is, do you guys remember, do you guys know clearfix, or the clearfix trick in order to get your floats to behave properly? There is actually now a property, it is display flow root, that will prevent you from needing to do the clearfix trick. So display flow root on the parent will actually act the same way as if you were added a clear fix. I think group is also another name for it, to the parent container, if you just give it a display flow root. So we no longer have to use the clear fix hats. The cool thing with this is that you can actually do a lot of really fun stuff with your shapes. By using clip path and shape outside, you can actually change the shape of your image and have your text flow around that shape and follow the curve or follow whatever shape you decide to put in there. But that's an entirely full talking in and of itself on how to do that. But I do encourage you to go look at how to do that, because in the middle of your text, that can make some pretty awesome stuff. It works beautifully with curves and with circles, for example. So all of the, last bit. Notice how in all of the examples I have shown, I have used actual text. I have not used lorem ipsum. I have not used cupcake ipsum, bacon ipsum, or anything with the last part of its name landing in ipsum. And the reason for that is when you're doing typography, part of it is, yes, making it beautiful, but part of it is making sure that it is readable. And you can't know if it's readable if the text that you have in front of you is not something that you can read. Because I don't know about you, but I don't read lorem ipsum. Cupcake ipsum to some extent, but it's still not a natural flow of text. So what I generally do is I go to something like the Gutenberg project, and I'll pick out a book that I don't mind, or pick up a poem that I don't mind, and I'll stick that in. And that's what I use when I'm trying to lay out something if I don't have the final text available to me. That way, it's something that you can actually read, so you can tell whether or not it's legible or not when you're dealing with the font. For these particular examples, I used Beowulf and Peter Pan, both taken off of the Gutenberg project. So that is what I have for you guys. The code for all of the examples that I showed is available on my GitHub. Feel free to take a pic of the QR code or to grab the URL. I will actually post the URL in the chat and in Twitter here in a second. And I will take any question anybody has at this point. What criteria do you use when selecting fonts? So basically what I do is, I'll just show it. I go to Google Fonts. And generally speaking, what I do is for general bodies of text, I'm not really going to go into like the header typey stuff. I'll go over here and select category, and because I know that I'm going to want something sans serif, so I uncheck all these. Language-wise, it depends, but it depends on what I'm working on. But for the most part, I generally tend to use Latin extended, simply because that's going to have a lot more of the special characters, such as your ampersands and fun stuff. And then I'm generally going to say for my numbers of styles, I'm going to want at least like 3 or 4, because that if I do at least 3, generally it means that I'm going to have at least a regular and italics in the book. You can push that a little bit, and then from there, it depends on what my project is. If I know I'm looking for something kind of modern, kind of whatever, I'll just scroll through here and kind of go from there. You can actually adjust the sentence. So I can adjust the sentence to what I want. So if I'm doing like logo work, or if I'm trying to figure out what typography might work well for the brand, I may include the brand name. So let's use Code PaLOUsa in there. So I may say, okay, does it look good, and does it fit with the style of my logo, for example? So I might do that as well as I'm picking. And then it's just a matter of scrolling through and what speaks to you or what doesn't. The other thing that you can do is say, okay, we'll pick one at random. Say this one's kind of cool. What you can do is look at the about, and it'll tell you a little bit of history about the font, so that you can know why it was created, for whom, and those sorts of things, to see if that kind of fits with what you're thinking. If it doesn't, like now you're getting into, some more deep stuff. Some of them have descriptions in terms of why it was created. Some of them do not. Some of them just have more descriptions of what they did with the font and what it contains. Like this one doesn't have a whole lot of history. This one's more about what it contains, right? If I do, let's say I'll pick, pick Comic Sans. Oh, because it's not gonna, it doesn't fit my criteria, because it is. Let's see that. Comic Sans. It's trademarked, so what it's going to do is it's going to send me, because it's not a Google font, right? It's trademarked. It's going to send me to somewhere else to go find it. And if I'm Comic Sans regular, and what I can do is I can actually find, they actually don't have it. Linotype.com does. We'll have a history. Apparently fonts.com does not. By the way, those websites that sell fonts are still actually known as foundries, even though they're producing digital stuff. They're not producing web stuff anymore. I'm trying to think of one that might actually have a history in it. Maybe Roboto. No, it doesn't. The other cool thing that when you're trying to decide fonts, if you want to put more than one font, is when you pick a font, or when if you're browsing for stuff. So let's say I like this one. At the bottom, it'll show you things that it goes well with. And so you can actually look at what that's going to look like. So if you're trying to pick title versus body of text, that's also a good way to kind of get an idea for what would work well with it or not. I mean, you don't have to limit yourself to what's proposed there, but those are always a fun way to figure out, if you're kind of needing ideas on what to pair it with. The big thing when pairing fonts is make sure they're distinct enough that it doesn't look like a mistake, that you accidentally use the wrong font somewhere. Any other questions? Do you have any tips for preventing your layout from breaking in an application where you can't adjust font size? Yeah, absolute positioning is going to be the bane of your existence, because like let me actually pull up this thing. Let me just pull it up. Did it not copy it? That is not definitely not it. Copy. There. So if I go to the demo, please tell me I have a demo. Yeah. So if I go, let's pick Beowulf. Well, let's not pick Beowulf. Let's pick Peter Pan. Let's pick Peter Pan. Okay. So I can totally increase my font, right? But because I don't have absolute positioning, I put a max width and then do just width. It's just going to reflow correctly, right? Or if I decrease, well, this one has a max width fairly small. So, but if I change my max width, right? If I change the max width to, it's intersection, max width. Let's say I change my max width to something much larger. Okay. Now because I'm not dealing with the fixed width, I can increase the font and I can decrease just fine because it's just gonna reflow. So if you're doing things in terms of percent and in terms of max sizes and min sizes, that's gonna decrease a lot of your problems. Does that make sense? Anything else? You guys are welcome to turn on video and actually talk to me. I mean, chat is fine, but if you feel comfortable with it, you are more than welcome to. Well, I think if nobody else has any more questions, I think our time block has come to an end. So I am going to let you guys go and let you guys have a wonderful lunch. And I'll see everybody back again sometime this afternoon.